House of the Dragon Season 1, we find out from Viserys about Aegon's prophecy, that he dreamed of the White Walkers and the coming winter, and this is why he chose to invade Westeros, to try and unify the realm to fight off the oncoming Long Night. It has been confirmed that this addition to the show came directly from George R. R. Martin. Fans speculated for a long time knowledge of the Long Night was Aegon's reasons for the conquest, but George, wanting to include it in House of the Dragon, firms up that idea a lot. This new knowledge about Aegon really makes you rethink Targaryen history before the conquest, and specifically Aegon's history, and makes some of his more random actions make more sense in context of his knowledge, and also allows us to speculate on some other possible pre-conquest events that were likely to have happened. In a way, this new information really reshapes what we think we know about pre-conquest House Targaryen and Aegon himself. Fire and Blood, The World of Ice and Fire, and to some extent the minimal sources from the main book, give a brief look into what House Targaryen was doing on Dragonstone for nearly 114 years before Aegon looked west towards Westeros. Much of what happened in this time is a mystery, lost to history. You sort of have to read in between the lines to piece together the information. But before we knew about Aegon's prophecy, it did seem very odd that the Targaryens were just hanging about on Dragonstone for so long. Aegon one day randomly decided to invade Westeros. The prophecy makes that seemingly random decision make a little bit more sense, but still, 114 years is a long time. So what were House Targaryen up to for so long? So before we get into Aegon himself, what were House Targaryen doing for so long? In Fire and Blood, we get told that House Targaryen, after moving to Dragonstone, quickly began to control trade in and out of Blackwater Bay, all the while slowly building up their influence within Westeros itself. We must not forget they were foreigners, moving from halfway across the world. Yes, they were rich, yes, they had dragons, but they lacked those connections and bonds to the other houses of Westeros. Bonds that take time to form. Much of these early years would have been spent building influence in and around Blackwater Bay, and around the coast and islands with houses such as Celtigar of Claw Isle and House Velaryon of Driftmark. Both also happen to be houses with Velaryon heritage. The fact that House Targaryen married into House Velaryon several times during this era, with Aegon's own mother being a Velaryon, suggests there was some low-level political matchmaking happening to help secure their position of power within the local area. Given House Targaryen's obsession with keeping their Valyrian blood as pure as possible, if incestuous marriages within House Targaryen itself were not possible, it would make sense to marry into one of the other few houses in the world left with Valyrian blood as the next best option. Aegon the Exile fled the Doom of Valyria with a total of 5 dragons. By the time of Aegon the Conqueror, Balerion was the only one of the original 5 to escape the Doom left alive. This means somehow 4 dragons died. Given that we don't hear of House Targaryen fighting in any wars during that time, we can presume they died of old age. Vhagar and Meraxes then hatched at some point in those 114 years. A curious observation is that post-conquest, dragons seem to be hatched quite regularly, to the point dozens of dragons are alive at the peak of Targaryen Westeros. So I do find it curious that in 114 years on Dragonstone, as far as we know, only 2 dragons were hatched. The first confirmed war we know that House Targaryen fought was in fact involving Aegon the Conqueror himself. Aegon assisted Pentos and Tyrosh in their war with Volantis. During the Century of Blood, he flew on Balerion to Pentos to meet with the city's magisters, after flying to Lys, where he burned the Volantine fleet before they could invade the city. Again, I find it very odd Aegon would involve himself in a war that has nothing to do with him or Westeros, seemingly gaining little from it. However, if Aegon had had his prophecy by this time, and is intent on invading Westeros, he may have joined the war to gain experience in combat, given the fact as far as we know he never fought a war, let alone use his dragon as a weapon before. Perhaps he did this to test himself before looking west. It could also have helped prove his theory to himself that with 3 dragons he could easily take Westeros. One of the very few things we know that Aegon did pre-conquest as a fact is that he and Visenya visited Old Town and the Arbor, with rumours suggesting he visited Lannisport as well. This counters the common myth and misunderstanding that Aegon and his sisters had never stepped foot on the mainland of Westeros before the conquest. If they visited these places, it's fair to reason they probably visited others as well that we don't know about. Perhaps Aegon scouted out Harrenhal while it was being built. Maybe, given his prophecy, he ventured north to the Wall to seek the truth himself. However, the issue with that idea is if he did head north, reasons suggest he would have stopped at Winterfell on the way. But if that did happen, there would have been some record of it, and none seems to exist. Also, surely if Aegon flew the biggest dragon in the world to the Wall, again, there would have been some record of it within the Night's Watch. And that for me is the big issue with the concept of Aegon's prophecy. If Aegon chose to invade the whole continent because of some apocalyptic dream he had, then surely he would, fly to the wall, check it out for himself, talk to the Starks and find out more. However, we know that while in Old Town, Aegon did visit the Citadel, so perhaps he found something there that confirms his prophecy enough for him to invade. But even this idea has some issues, as there are some suggestions that Aegon had decided to invade before his trip to Old Town. One of the things that stands out the most within the conquest is how House Hightower, the Lords of Old Town, did not send any of their significantly large army when King Mern Gardner called his banners. Thus, they were not at the field of fire, making them one of the very few stronger military forces in the wake of the conquest. This goes further when you consider that when Aegon reached Old Town, he found the gates of the city open to him, and he took it without a fight. Maybe House Hightower saw sense after learning the fate of Harrenhal and the field of fire, and saw fighting was hopeless. However, with them not sending troops in the first place, maybe they already had a truce with Aegon, agreed during this trip to Old Town. The idea of Aegon's trip to Old Town gets even more intriguing when you consider the idea that it was in fact a diplomatic mission. The Hightower's actions are suspect enough, but there's also something else at play that often gets overlooked. Aegon's conversion to the faith of the Seven, from we presume a Valyrian religion. On the surface, he had no real reason to do this, as he had more than enough firepower to steamroll Westeros without doing this. It just so happens that the centre of the faith of the Seven is Old Town and the Starry Sept, where the High Septon is located. It stands to reason that Aegon knew being a member of the faith would make ruling Westeros in the wake of his conquest much more straightforward, also making him more palatable to the local lords and small folk. He perhaps also did this to gain the support of the faith itself, given how much power and influence the faith has. Taking Westeros is one thing, but holding it is another matter altogether, and the faith's support goes a long way in making that job a lot easier. Just look what happens when the crown does not have the support of the faith. Under King Aenys and into the rule of Maegor, the faith militant uprising almost brought down the whole Targaryen dynasty despite their power and dragons. In A Dance of the Dragons, we have the Shepherd during the Moon of Madness, who again creates a situation that almost ruins House Targaryen. Even in the main books, we have the current situation with the faith is very telling, especially with the High Sparrow. The faith and the crown work hand in hand. Religion in Westeros is one thing that brings all people together, from the lords to the small folk, is one thing they will all rally behind. Thus, making Aegon more palatable as a ruler is so vital when you consider the actions of House Hightower during the conquest, Aegon's sudden conversion to the faith, and the possibility of Aegon using the Citadel to confirm his prophecy. It makes his trip with Visenya to Old Town look like a diplomatic and scouting mission. So what were House Targaryen doing for 114 years before Aegon looked west? Well, for the most part, it seemed like they were consolidating their power on a small scale and local level, controlling trade in and out of Blackwater Bay, and engaging in diplomacy with the small houses to create a power base to build from. It seems that Aegon's conquest was not a quick thing, but something that he thought about and planned for seemingly a long while, travelling Westeros and engaging in some form of diplomacy to make his invasion easier and ensure he could hold his new kingdom. George R. R. Martin bringing in the idea of Aegon's prophecy changes the way I look at pre-conquest House Targaryen a lot. Namely, for me, it answers a lot of questions that never made sense to me. Mostly, why did Aegon look west, not to Essos, with arguably more riches and closer ties to Old Valyria? It makes a lot of things make sense. The prophecy has been a fan theory for a long time before its inclusion in House of the Dragon. It helps create a single narrative through the 300 years of Targaryen history before the main books, making the events that happen relevant and important to the main story, and not just pure world building. I still have a lot of questions about what House Targaryen got up to before the conquest, and why they seem to do so little for 114 years. I do wonder if this may get fleshed out, but just like real world history, there's only so much that is documented and only so much that we know. The sad reality of history is more is lost to time than is recorded and preserved, and we only ever have a fragmented view. But that's why I enjoy George R. R. Martin's world building so much. It feels like real history to me because it mimics that concept.